Thanks very much, and thanks to all the witnesses for the presentations. I missed the very beginning of it because I was out in the picket lines, but I just wanted to ask for my starting point. Kieran Byrne mentioned earlier on that there's a single homogenous definition of communities, and I just want to tease out what that might be. So, for example, back in 2018, I met with a class, a sixth-year class, a Leaving Cert class from a boys' school in Sutton. They came regularly to the Dáil looking for our support because they had worked out a plan, and it was really, really interesting to see young men working out the science and the preciseness of what they were doing to solar power the entire school and all its needs, and to have these panels located on the roof. And they were looking everywhere for support and were getting none back in the day. If you're familiar with the project, you might respond to it. But what struck me was that they weren't getting a good response from any department, including at the time the SEAI. And I think, if I remember correctly, the total amount it would have cost was about €20,000, when they were willing to do fundraising to try and raise about half of it, but they weren't getting support. Now, had that been supported, and if it was, you can tell me, and had it worked, then you have a school in a community that has set an example that could be rolled out elsewhere, that nearly every school could take on board, not just as part of an education of the Leaving Cert science students, but also as part of showing what can be done to power through renewable energy, an aspect of the community, which is why I'm asking about this homogenous definition of community. And the other point I'd like to make about definitions of communities is that, like, I live in Dublin South Central, one of the poorest, one of the most I wouldn't say disadvantaged, but has a high level of low income earners. Right throughout the inner city, places like Ballyfermot, Crumlin, etc. And if they're not highly organised into community groups, how do they get to know or get to access this kind of project that you're talking about? In other words, do the SEAI and other bodies see as part of their job an outreach programme to make sure that all communities are engaged and to ensure that there's nobody left behind? Because somebody did mention earlier on that the focus is on delivering deeper retrofits, and it's government policy and SEAI policy and very expensive and all the rest of it. But surely we should be starting at the very basics and ensure that everybody has some way of accessing renewables, but also, and dare I mention it, as Richard Bruton did, the question of retrofitting. And on that, I know that the Chair doesn't want us to dwell on it, but on that I do have a question. I come across loads and loads of people who maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, got support to get their attic lagged, and that is now not sufficient. Either the material used at the time wasn't good enough, but they're living in very, very cold homes. And every time I go back to the SEAI, I'm told they had work done, they're not getting anything else done. Okay. Now, has that changed? And can I have a definite answer on that? Because I get mixed messages from the SEAI every time I contact them. On it. And lastly, just to ask about charging points in parking blocks. 4.5 minutes now. Yeah, a charging
very quickly, Deputy Smith.
Can we ensure that they are speeded up for areas where people are keen to have their electric cars charged but have no access to charging points? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Smith. I'm glad to hear that yourself and Deputy Bruton are on the same page. I think it's a first. Dr. Byrne.
I'm not clear that I talked about a single homogenous definition of communities, but if I did, Nicole, let me clarify that remark. There is no single homogenous definition of communities. One of the key skills and strengths of our community programme is that we have a very flexible approach to communities, and that's how my colleague outlined that earlier on. I will hand over to my colleague to talk a bit more about I don't know if we've detailed the specific issue with schools programme, but we can certainly talk about the outreach and programme and access. Just in terms of, I'll do your very last question first. You're talking about the attics being retrofitted and lagged and whatnot. I'm presuming, I make an assumption that they might be under the Warmer Homes programme, which is a free energy upgrades. And if that's the case, a policy change was announced in February of this year that we are facilitating revisits to homes. So previously, heretofore, it would have been that the home would have been visited once and that was it. We've changed that policy now that homes will be revisited again. And so we will be able to go back to those homes as part of the overall revisit strategy. I might hand over to my colleague to talk more about the specific, if we have details and specifics on the outreach.
Certainly.
Thank
So
you.
I think that the Sutton School may have been one of our SECs. The actual details of their grant application I wouldn't be familiar with, but from the earlier work that my colleague Brian mentioned, grant applications have to come in with more than one technology, so a single technology application into the grant programme is challenging, and that may be why it's unsuccessful. But I'm happy to look into the case and revert back to you when we get the details of it. In terms of outreach, certainly a huge part of what the sustainable energy communities do is try to engage their wider community. So our communities typically come from the likes of local development committees, tidy towns, groups that are well used to outreach. In addition to that, the mentors that we have supporting the communities are specifically tasked with networking within all local community organisations and groups to make people aware of it. So we keep the mentor very close within the local authority area, so they are local to where the communities are active. Further to outreach, we also have a schools programme. So we offer free workshops on climate change to schools, 2 levels within primary and then also in the junior cycle cert as well. And we do workshops with teachers. So we're very active in outreach. We host a large number of events ourselves, and we participate in a lot of events that our communities host as well.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Smith was...
Well, thanks for the answer, but I wonder, could you explain why, if there's an application to power a school by solar, why it has to have 2 different technologies attached? Why is solar not sufficient?
The approach is that the grant programme that funds the community grants is actually an energy efficiency programme, whereas solar would be seen as a renewable electricity programme. And to say that we have a fabric first approach to the allocation of grants. So the first attempt is to reduce the amount of energy required by the building, and then we look at renewable technologies to support it. So if the technology was only on solar, it wouldn't have typically been successful. It would have been the approach within the grant programme at the time.
And do you think that's worthwhile reviewing?
I think there are other areas that are developing that will make opportunities for schools to participate and other buildings to participate in solar without having to go through the trouble of a grant programme, with the opportunity for the clean export premium that will come in later this year. So they'll be paid for any excess power, and the economics of a project such as that, I suppose the payback will be an awful lot shorter, making it an awful lot easier to participate in that. And it is an opportunity for other buildings to see where renewable technologies suit their energy demand.
Mr. Summers is indicating to come in there.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I suppose as I mentioned in earlier comments, the Microgeneration support scheme is currently offering grants for domestic solar PV, but within the next couple of months that will be extended to the non-domestic sector, including schools, community organisations, as a single measure. So it will be an upfront capital grant towards the cost of solar PV, and if that's up to 6 kilowatts. Now, just within the context of schools specifically, there are guidelines in place from the Department of Education around solar PV that limit the size of the installation. Their view is that if I'm correct, the maximum size for a primary school is 2 kilowatts and for a secondary school is 4 kilowatts. Now, we understand that may be subject to review by the Department of Education in the context of revisions and the requirements under REPowerEU, for example, to accelerate the deployment of renewables. If schools want to go for a larger system and they can fund it, there's also the opportunity in the future to get the Clean Export Premium Tariff, which will be between 6 and 50 kilowatts.